the last section that we need to discuss is reproductive strategies. This is covered in section 16.4 of your textbook. It would be a good idea for you to read this section if you haven't read it already. And basically, we're going to compare some sexual and some asexual reproductive strategies for different types of cells. In general, sexual reproduction relies on meiosis, forming gametes, and leads to variation. So if I had to sum up what all types of sexual reproduction have in common, this would be the general idea. Some cells undergo meiosis to produce gametes, and because we're producing gametes that are different from the parent, we end up with variation. Asexual reproduction generally relies on mitosis. And in mitosis, we get identical daughter cells. So that would be the basic comparison that we would make between the two types. Now, a lot of the time, you will hear me or someone say that variation is probably a good thing. But one of the things I will mention here is that sexual reproduction generally is slow, whereas asexual reproduction generally is faster. So, even though it's advantageous to have variation, there are lots of organisms who give up that advantage to have the speed of reproduction because that is more advantageous to them. So I'm not saying that sexual reproduction is better than asexual. It depends what kind of environment an organism is in and what kind of needs they have. So we're going to start by talking about prokaryotic cells. Now, binary fission and a picture that looks like this one can be found in your textbook on page 574. So if you didn't print things out, you can find a diagram very similar to this one on that page. Binary fission happens in bacteria, which are prokaryotic cells. Does anyone know the difference between a prokaryotic and a eukaryotic cell? We have eukaryotic cells. Yeah, go ahead, take a guess. That's okay. Anyone remember hearing these words before? If you took science time with me, you absolutely heard them because I know I taught them to you. No one wants to guess though, hey? So, oh, you got a thing? Yeah, so we're talking about what do you actually see in the cell. A prokaryotic cell does not have distinct membrane-bound organelles. So it absolutely has DNA, but it's not organized in a nucleus like it would be in, say, a plant or an animal cell, which are eukaryotic. So prokaryotic cells lack the typical organelles that you see in other cells. They have ribosomes. They absolutely have DNA. They very often have a cell wall as well as a cell membrane. But bacteria would be our example of prokaryotic cells. Binary fission is how bacteria reproduce asexually. So binary fission is an asexual process. If you take a look at what's happening in binary fission, the first thing that happens is that the cell replicates its DNA. Sounds a lot like S phase of mitosis in a regular cell. The next thing that happens is the cytoplasm elongates and we separate. Kind of sounds like anaphase of mitosis. Third thing, cross walls form, the membrane invaginates, which means it pinches in. Sounds a lot like telophase. Lastly, we have the cross wall forms completely. Sounds a lot like cytokinesis. And finally, I have two identical daughter cells. So what should you know about binary fission? It's basically mitosis. The only thing that's different is that it's happening in a prokaryotic cell, so we've got slightly different looking steps. But if I look at this, the cell replicating its DNA is kind of like the S phase. This is kind of like anaphase. That's kind of like telophase. This is kind of like cytokinesis. So we have very comparable steps happening. At no point do I think you would ever have to label a diagram of a bacterium undergoing binary fission with a bunch of terminology, but rather recognize that this is a method of asexual reproduction that will produce two identical daughter cells. So for prokaryotic cells, this would be the typical method of asexual reproduction. And sometimes people think, oh, that's all they can do. They're so small. How could they possibly perform sexual reproduction? But they actually can. So binary fission is one thing that prokaryotic cells do. The next thing is their method of sexual reproduction. So before I go there, does anyone want to ask questions about binary fission? Yes. Very similar to mitosis. So the only thing really that's different is if you look here, we have the lack of a very distinct prophase and metaphase. In prophase, the nuclear membrane is supposed to decompose, but a prokaryotic cell doesn't even have one, so that step is kind of pointless. As well, they have circular DNA instead of chromosomes that are in a straight line, and so metaphase would not look the same way. They kind of have globs of DNA that just separate in half. But basically, I can see something that looks like S of interphase, anaphase, telophase, cytokinesis, and my two identical daughter cells. It's almost the same process. The next one is conjugation. Again, this is for bacteria, which are prokaryotic. And this is their method of sexual reproduction. Now, there is not a picture in your textbook that represents very descriptively what conjugation is. So I'm going to highlight the key points. There is some terminology on this picture that you definitely would not have to be responsible for. One of the things that you would have to be responsible for knowing is this word. And you'll see right here, that's where it is on the picture. So this happens when two bacterial cells attach to each other. You have the conjugation pilus, which sometimes is just called a bridge, a cytoplasmic bridge. But the pilus is the connection between two bacterial cells. And basically what's going to happen is that one cell is going to pass some DNA across this little bridge to the other cell. So you'll see here, one is called plus, one is called minus, because one has some DNA and the other one doesn't have it. So all that's going to happen is after this bridge forms between them, the cells contact each other, so you've got this space where there is cytoplasm that can flow between the two cells. And this is where exchange of DNA from one cell to the other occurs. So basically, one bacteria comes into contact with another, they make a little bridge, and the first one sends some DNA across the bridge to the other one. At the end, you can see that now they both have that piece of DNA in them, but that doesn't mean that the rest of their DNA is the same. This picture is showing dark purple and light purple, so it might not be excessively distinctive. But we're not saying that these two cells are identical. We're saying that a small piece of DNA got given from one cell to the other, but definitely not the entire set of DNA. At the end of this, you have two cells, and they are not identical. So this is a method for a bacterial cell to have a bit of variation instead of just having identical copies because it relied on binary fission. Now, does anyone want to ask anything about any of these methods here? So those are our two methods for prokaryotic cells. So bacteria would be our example of prokaryotic cells. The rest of our discussion will be about eukaryotic cells, and we're mostly going to focus on asexual reproduction because there is an entire chapter, actually two chapters, that are dedicated to sexual reproduction in animals, specifically humans. So we will talk about it at length. But there are a few different methods of asexual reproduction in eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells are like plant cells, animal cells, fungi, protists, anything basically other than bacteria. Now there are 5 methods on this list, and I tried to put a little representative picture of most of them. Some of these you might remember learning before. I know I taught junior high, and this was part of one of my junior high lessons, so maybe you recall these. Budding is when a miniature version forms and it is attached to the parent. And this is generally what we would call it when an animal is doing this type of reproduction. In all of these types of asexual reproduction, we are getting genetically identical offspring, so I'm not going to repeat that every single time. So my picture down here illustrates budding. It's like a little mini-me forming on the side of the organism. So if you imagine, in cartoons they'll show like the angel and the devil on people's shoulders. If that was a real thing, like it was actually growing there, that would be budding. We would be growing a tiny miniature version that's identical to the parent, and it would be attached. Now, vegetative reproduction is a lot like budding, but because you see the word vegetative, this is what's happening in plants. In vegetative reproduction, we get a new plant from usually something that seems a lot like a runner. So if you take a look at the picture down here, this is a strawberry. Do any of you have strawberries in your yard? My parents try to grow strawberries all the time, and they get like 8 strawberries, not strawberry plants, 8 strawberries every year. But if you've ever watched how a strawberry plant grows, you will have an original plant, and then it will send out like an extra little stem, like a little outgrowth. That's the runner. And this runner will move along the soil. Sometimes you can see them because they're right on the surface of the soil. And then it will develop a new set of roots, new stem, new leaves, and you will get a new plant coming from that runner. So vegetative reproduction is very similar to budding, where we're getting a small new organism still attached to the parent. Fragmentation could happen in plants or in animals. The idea here is that a new organism develops from a fragment. So a really good example of this is what happens with starfish. That's why I have a picture down here. Many of you might be aware that starfish, along with some other organisms like salamanders, can regenerate limbs if they are removed. There are other types of organisms that can regenerate a whole new organism from a piece that was removed. If you cut a worm in half, there's lots of worms, but if you cut a worm in half the right way, you could actually end up having 2 worms develop from that. If it's in a plant, it's a little more basic. I have an aunt who has a really green thumb. She can grow anything. And so she regularly will grow like these beautiful flowers and then just snip a piece of it off and give it to someone else who is incapable of making the flower grow. You just stick it in water, new roots will form. So fragmentation is where I'm growing a new organism from a piece that was removed or cut off of the original parent organism. So budding and vegetative reproduction are very similar. In fragmentation, the new organism is not physically attached to the original organism. Now the next one, parthenogenesis, this is something that if I was going to guess like which of these strategies would they ask about on a diploma question, it would be this one because it has a lot to do with chromosome number. This is where an unfertilized egg develops and becomes an adult. That means that it is haploid and the adult is also haploid, which is weird. Normally, we would see organisms develop and the normal state is to be diploid and to have 2 N chromosomes. Bees are a really good example of this. Do you know how bees work? Honeybees. There's the queen. She lays a bunch of eggs. The eggs develop into the worker bees. So she is the sole parent of all of her worker bees. So they would be genetically identical. Now I've seen other examples of this happening in fish. I read an article about fish that do this. Generally, organisms that develop this way, they tend to be sterile as adults.